The room is cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from an air conditioner, but the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, reminding you that the place you're standing in is built for one purpose: death. It's just after sunrise in Huntsville, Texas. A light mist clings to the prison yard, and the high gray walls look even taller today. Inside, deep within the walls of the Texas State Penitentiary, a man wakes up knowing that this is it. There are no more appeals, no last-minute miracles, no chance to walk out alive. His name is Stephen Lewyane Nelson. By nightfall, his heart will stop beating by the hands of the state of Texas. But before that moment comes, Nelson will eat one last meal, speak one last sentence, and take one final walk down a corridor that's earned a chilling nickname among inmates: the last mile. Nelson's story is not just another death row execution. His name is etched into Texas's long, dark history of capital punishment because of the crime that brought him here. A crime so brutal, so senseless, that it sent shockwaves through a church congregation, a city, and an entire state. But before we get to that, you need to understand something. Death row in Texas isn't just a place. It's a slow-motion graveyard where every tick of the clock sounds louder than the last. This morning, Nelson sits on the edge of a narrow steel bed in a cell no bigger than a walk-in closet. The walls are bare except for a few peeling paint spots, the air thick with the scent of disinfectant and metal. His hands are cuffed, but his eyes tell a different story. Some say they've seen fear in them today. Others swear they see nothing, just a cold emptiness. The guards outside his cell are silent. They've done this before, too many times to count. For them, today is procedure. For Nelson, it's the end of everything. Later, when the clock creeps closer to his execution hour, a tray will slide into his cell. On it will be his last meal. Texas used to allow extravagant final requests, but after one infamous inmate mocked the tradition, the rules changed. Now Nelson's final plate will come straight from the prison kitchen, no matter what he wants. Still, the choice is symbolic. What a man eats before dying says more than most people realize. But perhaps the most haunting moment is yet to come. At exactly 6 p.m., Nelson will be escorted to the death chamber. Witnesses, family members of the victim, journalists, and officials will watch from behind a glass wall. Some will be there for closure, others for justice, and some just to hear the last words of a man who committed one of Texas's most disturbing murders in recent memory. No one knows exactly what he'll say. Will he confess? Will he apologize? Will he spit out defiance in the face of death? Or will he say nothing at all, taking his final secrets with him into the grave? By the time the sun sets, we'll have the answer. But to truly understand the weight of this moment, we have to go back to the day when Stephen Lewyane Nelson's life and the lives of his victims collided in a way that would end in blood, heartbreak, and a one-way ticket to Texas's death row. And it all started in the most unexpected place imaginable. It was March 3rd, 2011, a Thursday morning in Arlington, Texas. The sun had barely risen when the quiet stillness of the city was shattered by a scene that would haunt the community for years. Inside North Point Baptist Church, Pastor Clint Dobson was starting his day like any other. At 28 years old, Clint was known for his kindness, his calm spirit, and the way he made everyone feel welcome. That morning, he wasn't delivering a sermon. He was working in his office, preparing for Sunday service, and going over outreach plans with the church secretary, Judy Elliott. They couldn't have known that. Just outside, 2 men were about to force their way inside. Men with no connection to the church, no mercy, and no hesitation. One of them was Stephen Lewyane Nelson, the other, Mark Porter. Nelson wasn't looking for salvation. He was looking for money, for valuables, for anything he could take. But what happened next went far beyond robbery. Once inside, Nelson and Porter overpowered Pastor Clint and Judy. They tied their hands, gagged them, and began demanding information: bank cards, PIN numbers, access to valuables. For Clint, who had dedicated his life to faith and compassion, the attack was incomprehensible, but the cruelty was just beginning. What followed was a brutal, prolonged assault. Nelson beat Pastor Clint until his skull fractured, using such force that investigators later described the crime scene as shockingly violent. Judy Elliott was also attacked, beaten so severely that she was left for dead. Nelson and Porter fled the church in Clint's car, carrying stolen items, electronics, credit cards, and anything of value they could find. But their escape wouldn't last long. Judy, though critically injured, managed to survive. In an act of sheer willpower, she crawled toward a phone and called for help. When police arrived, they found Clint's lifeless body on the church floor, surrounded by the chaos left behind. Judy was rushed to the hospital, barely clinging to life, but she lived and would later become a key witness. The news spread quickly. For the congregation, it felt like a violation of sacred space, violence inside the house of God. For the city, it was a chilling reminder that brutality could erupt anywhere, even in the safest places. The manhunt for Nelson and Porter moved fast. Surveillance cameras, stolen credit card transactions, and witness statements painted a clear picture. Within days, both men were in custody. Nelson, defiant and unrepentant, faced questioning with a cold detachment that unsettled even seasoned detectives. The death sentence was read in a quiet courtroom, but its echo followed Stephen Lewyane Nelson all the way to the most feared address in Texas, the Allan B. Polunsky unit. Unlike most prisons, Polunsky doesn't have a general population wing for death row inmates. Here, condemned prisoners live in near total isolation from the moment they arrive until the moment they leave in a hearse. For Nelson, this was his new world. His cell measured just 6 by 10 feet, bare concrete walls, a steel bunk, a toilet sink combo, and a narrow slit of a window that let in a thin slice of sunlight on clear days. The door was solid metal with only a small food slot. Inmates on Texas death row spend 23 hours a day in that cell. The other hour is spent alone in a caged recreation yard, barely bigger than the cell itself. There are no televisions in the cells, no physical contact with visitors. Conversations happen through thick plexiglass. Meals are delivered through the slot, eaten alone. The air smells of disinfectant and sweat, and the silence is broken only by the occasional clanging of doors or the shouts of other inmates echoing down the tier. At first, Nelson kept to himself, speaking little to guards or inmates. But over the years, those who watched him said he showed little sign of remorse. Some officers described him as unpredictable, calm one day, aggressive the next. Others said he seemed to enjoy small acts of defiance, as if to prove the system hadn't broken him. Life on death row is a strange mix of routine and waiting. The routine keeps you alive. The waiting kills you slowly. Days blend into months, months into years. Appeals move at a glacial pace, and every court decision becomes a moment of false hope or crushing finality. For Nelson, there were no surprise reversals, no last-minute legal victories. One by one, his appeals were denied. Each rejection was another step closer to the inevitable. The clock was ticking, even if the calendar didn't seem to move. He read occasionally, mostly legal papers and a few novels. He wrote letters, some to family, others to people who reached out to him, curiosity seekers, death penalty opponents, and even those drawn to the darkness of infamous crimes. Sometimes he replied, sometimes he ignored them. Inmates here developed their own way of counting time, not by hours or days, but by events: a lockdown, a visit, a guard rotation, a death warrant being signed, and in early 2024, Nelson's own countdown officially began. The state set his execution date. From that moment, everything changed. Death row inmates who have a date become what's known as death watch inmates. They're moved to a different area, closer to the execution chamber in Huntsville. Their world becomes even smaller, their movements even more restricted. Guards watch them constantly. Every action, every word is noted. Some prisoners grow more talkative in these final months. Others withdraw entirely. Nelson seemed to exist somewhere in between. He spoke when necessary, but often sat for hours staring at the wall, deep in thought, or perhaps not thinking at all. By the final week, even those who had worked around him for years could sense a change. His posture slumped. His voice grew quieter. Whether it was fear, acceptance, or something else entirely, no one could say for certain. But one thing was clear. The man who had walked into a church 13 years earlier, full of rage and violence, was now walking steadily toward his own fate. The morning of his final day would arrive soon enough. And with it, the last choices he would ever make. It was just past 6 a.m. when the heavy steel door clanged open. Stephen Lewyane Nelson's final day had begun. The cell lights flickered on, bathing the cramped room in a harsh, pale glow. 2 guards stood in the doorway, silent, professional, unreadable. One of them carried a clipboard with the day's schedule. There wasn't much on it. Final meal, visits, execution. Nelson rose slowly from his bunk. His expression was neutral, but the slight tremor in his hands gave him away. This wasn't just another morning. This was the last morning. Prison protocol dictates that an inmate on death watch is under constant observation in their final hours. Guards escorted Nelson to the showers, where he was given a fresh set of white prison clothes, clean, pressed, and identical to the clothes worn by hundreds of others who had walked the same path. He dressed without a word. Breakfast was served, though few inmates eat much on execution day. Nelson barely touched his tray. He sat in silence, staring at the wall, occasionally glancing toward the narrow window that offered a view of nothing but sky. By late morning, his first and only visitors arrived, members of his family. Visits on the final day are held in a small, sterile room separated by thick glass. Conversations are conducted through a phone receiver, the line crackling with static. Reports say the meeting was quiet, emotional, and short. There were tears. There were long pauses. At one point, Nelson leaned forward, pressing his forehead to the glass, eyes closed. No one knows exactly what was said, but witnesses could see the heaviness in the room. Eventually, the guard tapped on the door, signaling that time was up. His family walked away, not knowing if they'd ever see him again in this life. At 2 p.m., Nelson made his final meal request. Texas no longer grants elaborate special orders, so the prison kitchen prepared what was available. The tray came with a cheeseburger, fries, baked beans, and iced tea. Some say he ate most of it, others claim he only picked at the fries. Either way, it was the last food he would ever taste. The hours between the final meal and the execution are the longest and the shortest of a man's life. Nelson paced his cell, sat on his bunk, lay down, got up again. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the clock. As the sun began to set, guards arrived for the final escort. The walk from the holding cell to the death chamber in Huntsville is short. Just a few steps for most men, but it feels endless. The hallway is narrow, lined with fluorescent lights that hum softly, the sound almost drowned out by the clinking of chains. Nelson's wrists and ankles were shackled. 2 guards held his arms. Another walked behind. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just kept moving forward until the green steel doors of the execution chamber came into view. Inside, the gurney waited under bright lights. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic. Through a glass partition, witnesses were already seated. Members of Pastor Clint Dobson's family, journalists and officials from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Some sat with folded arms, others with clenched fists. Nelson was guided onto the gurney, leather straps securing his arms, legs, and chest. The fourth lines were prepared. The warden stood nearby, watching the clock. In a few minutes, Nelson would be asked if he had any last words. Whatever he said, or didn't say, would be etched into the history of Texas death row. The clock struck 6 p.m. inside the Huntsville unit. The execution room was silent except for the soft hiss of the ventilation system. On the other side of the glass, witnesses leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the man strapped to the gurney. Stephen Lewyane Nelson lay still, his head resting against the padded surface, the leather restraints holding his arms and legs in place. The IV lines, already inserted, snaked across the bed and disappeared behind the wall, where unseen hands would deliver the fatal dose. The warden stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Stephen Lewyane Nelson, do you have any final words?" For a long moment, Nelson didn't speak. His chest rose and fell slowly, eyes scanning the room. His gaze lingered on the faces of the victim's family, faces etched with pain, anger, and the weight of 13 years of waiting. Finally, he cleared his throat. I'm sorry," he began, his voice low but steady. "I know nothing I say can bring him back. I was wrong. I made choices that can't be undone. To his family, I pray you find peace. I'm ready to go home now." Some witnesses said they saw a single tear roll down his cheek. Others said he remained cold until the end, his apology rehearsed and hollow. But whatever the truth, those were the last words Stephen Lewyane Nelson would ever speak. The warden gave a small nod. Behind the wall, a medical official began the lethal injection process. The first drug, a powerful sedative, entered Nelson's veins. His breathing slowed. His eyelids grew heavy. Outside the chamber, the victim's family held hands. Some closed their eyes. Others didn't look away for a second, determined to see justice carried out. Within seconds, Nelson's body relaxed completely. The second drug followed, paralyzing his muscles, halting his ability to move or speak. The third and final drug stopped his heart. At 6:18 p.m., a doctor stepped forward, placed a stethoscope to Nelson's chest, and confirmed what everyone in the room already knew. "Time of death, 6:18, he said. The warden turned to the witness area. "This concludes the execution," he announced. The green steel doors opened, and the witnesses were escorted out. Some walked out with tears in their eyes. Others walked out with a sense of closure they had been denied for more than a decade. Inside the chamber, Nelson's body remained on the gurney, the leather straps still in place. It would be removed quietly, without ceremony, and transported to the prison morgue. In a few hours, it would be handed over to a funeral home or buried in a state cemetery if unclaimed. Outside the Huntsville unit, a small crowd had gathered, some holding candles, others holding signs for or against the death penalty. The media waited with cameras and microphones, ready to broadcast the final chapter of a story that had begun in a quiet church all those years ago. For Pastor Clint Dobson's family, the end of Nelson's life did not erase the pain of losing him. But for them, justice had finally been delivered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Huntsville returned to its usual stillness. Inside the walls of the prison, another cell on death row now stood empty, waiting for the next name, the next crime, the next final 24 hours. And somewhere in the echoes of the Green Mile, the last words of Stephen Lewyane Nelson faded into silence.